to say, Marilla has made me absolutely starving now. I'm just thinking, where is the corner in the south of Italy? I know a bit about Italy, so I'd love to know where it is exactly, or are you willing to share?
Yes, well, I'm from the city of Bari, which is in Puglia.
Oh, you're from Bari, okay, yeah.
In the region, it's like it's beautiful because it's a strip, because it's so long. It's what you would say the hill of the boot, if you can picture it as a boot. And so the region is such a thin strip on the sea, and it's amazing for that because the region is so long and thin, but the variety of food, the variety of they do say is one of the best regions, probably is the best region of Italy for food, because you get the variety of everything: fish, meat, and vegetables. Even my Sardinian family, because I'm also partly Sardinian, were extremely proud farmers and shepherds from the very center of Sardinia. They are like, they claim to be the best at everything they do. They always say that Puglian food is even better. So if they say that, I think it's true. But yeah, it's Puglia, which is, yeah, it's a beautiful place.
Yeah, so there we are. We all know where we're going on holiday next summer when we finally get released. And and given that everybody in the UK at least will probably have their vaccine by the summer, by the looks of things, we will be decamping en masse to Puglia. So we look forward to further restaurant recommendations in due course. Thank you, Mirella. Right, we're going to move ahead now with our keynote speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Brent Leggs, whose lecture is titled Building a True National Identity. Brent Leggs is the Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Senior Advisor and Adjunct Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Center for Preservation of Civil Rights Sites. Brent authored Preserving African American Historic Places and led efforts to establish the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. He promotes the equitable interpretation of America's diverse history as a tool for growing equity and justice. You're very welcome, Brent. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be with you today to share my passion and work for telling the full American story and building a true national identity. Next slide, please. What I wanted to do first was to share my personal journey and how I came to this work, because in the end, preservation is about stories and it's about people. So I had the good fortune when I was working on my grad degree at the University of Kentucky. I was working at a master's in historic preservation, and I was asked to conduct the statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. During this 1.5 year long research project, I would discover that my mom and a dad attended Rosenwald schools. I'm sure you haven't heard of this social movement and phenomenon, but Booker T. Washington in 1912 envisioned a massive school building program in partnership with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the second president of Sears and Roebuck. Together, they helped to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. The initial architect for the Rosenwald Schools building program was Robert Taylor, who was the first African-American graduate at MIT. And the landscape designer was none other than the legendary scientist and innovator, George Washington Carver. I literally remember touring a historic school that was being held up almost by a tree. The condition was pretty poor. But as I toured the inside of this historic space, I began to realize the quiet power of historic preservation. I had this multisensory experience and interaction with this history. I could hear the creaking floorboards as I walked that space. I could see the sunlight shining through the window panes. I could touch and smell and interact. But I also started to understand that there was a sixth sense, this transcendent nature to historic preservation. For me, historic preservation removed the gap between space and time, unlike any other form of history. What I thought was powerful was that the preservation of Rosenwald schools made Washington and Rosenwald's lives once lived real. Next slide, please. This is an example of a Rosenwald school. It has a classic window fenestration on one side of the building, and it was the most architecturally advanced school building plans at that time for African American children. And Rosenwald schools, they stand today as the physical manifestation of a social movement in response to a crisis in Black education. Next slide. These are the two legendary founders of that remarkable program. And I'm delighted to say that we are currently working to establish a national park to memorialize this important and overlooked American story. And this will become the first national park to honor the contributions of a Jewish American. Next slide. I have the good fortune to lead the largest preservation campaign ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places. It's called the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We created this program in 2017. You all probably remember the tragic events where culture, heritage, and public spaces collided in the most violent and negative ways. It was one of the first times that historic preservation was part of a national conversation and discourse. And we wanted to demonstrate that preservation was a tool for confronting some of the social and cultural crises facing Americans. Thus, the Action Fund was born. This image right here is when white nationalists rallied around a Thomas Jefferson sculpture on the campus of University of Virginia. This moment demonstrated their advocacy to create a new form of Jim Crow in the 21st century. So in many ways, the Action Fund in our work is helping to confront the miseducation of Americans. And most importantly, we are working to tell the full American story as a way to help our nation begin to revere and respect and value the full contributions of African Americans in American history. Next slide. So the Action Fund is about making room in American history. This is through our understanding of history, preservation, and social justice. It is a movement for enacting positive social change. In essence, we are working to redefine a new American culture and narrative for the purpose of creating a more just and equitable society. Next slide. What I want to do is to highlight some of the places and stories that we are working to memorialize and preserve, like Richmond, Virginia's Shaka Bottom. I think this image poses a particular question. How do you preserve the physical evidence of our past when it is no longer visible upon the American landscape? When you look at this, you wouldn't realize that this was once the second largest slaveholding center in the United States. Today is nothing more than parking lots and concrete and an undiscovered archaeological site. We got involved because the city of Richmond had proposed a nearly $100 million development project that we thought was inappropriate to construct a minor league baseball stadium, mixed-use development. And so we partnered with the local community to fight against that development, and we were successful in our efforts. The next thing is we wanted to empower the community to help them to realize their bold vision for linking together memorialization, education, and economic development. Next slide. This is the community-driven vision for creating a memorial park. It has great merit for bringing people together and using the power of place as a tool for healing and reconciliation. Next slide. I'm sure you have heard about James Madison, who is considered the father of the Constitution. This is his home where he drafted that document. This is also a site of enslavement. So we have been working at Montpelier for several years, and we created a permanent exhibition within the basement of this space to tell the story of the enslaved workers at Montpelier. It really is innovative and on the cutting edge of interpretation. We also brought together 50 scholars, museum professionals, and preservation practitioners to develop a rubric on teaching slavery interpretation and descendant engagement. And we are currently working with the descendant community and the Montpelier Foundation to create a shared authority and governance model that we hope to replicate at other similar traditional historic sites. Next slide. The African Meeting House in Boston, Massachusetts. This is where the abolitionist movement in the United States was born, where the legendary Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and other leaders of that movement would come together, a multiracial community of leaders who would publicly express their disdain for the institution of slavery. Next slide. President Woodrow Wilson's house here in Washington, D.C. President Woodrow Wilson is known for having a remarkable legacy for his international work. He is also known for being a segregationist president, and during his administration would resegregate the federal government. His public policy continues to impact Black America still to this day. We wanted to take the opportunity to reimagine the interpretation at one of our own National Trust historic sites. So we partnered with Davy Yarborough, a jazz musician and local artist who collaborated with Wellington High School students. They created a new composition that highlighted the DC counter-protest movement of the 1960s. And that new composition was performed inside of the President Woodrow Wilson house. This beautiful woman would play using his own piano. In many ways, this is how we are moving forward our values of equitable interpretation. Next slide. This is one of my early projects, and I had the good fortune of working with local and national stakeholders to celebrate the life and the legacy of Joe Frazier, two-time heavyweight champion of the world. He was a gold medal winner in boxing. And after his epic fight with Muhammad Ali, he would acquire this gym, own it for 4 decades, and unfortunately lost it in foreclosure the year that he passed away in 2011. Philadelphia is a city that's known for a fictional boxing hero known as Rocky, yet it had not fully celebrated a real-life sports legend, Joe Frazier. So we wanted to ensure that his beloved building would be protected in perpetuity. We designated it a Philadelphia landmark, listed it in the National Register of Historic Places, and I'm glad today to say that this building will forever stand to tell its story. Next slide. In the United States, we have 105 historically Black colleges and universities, including Howard University in Washington, D.C., which is known as the Harvard of HBCUs. Inside of this historic library building is where Howard Law School was once housed. Inside of this historic space is where Thurgood Marshall, who you see on the screen, Charles Hamilton Houston, they would devise the legal strategy used to desegregate America's public schools and would result in the historic legislation of Brown versus Board in 1954. We partnered with the university to develop a preservation plan as they look to modernize this library into a 21st century learning lab. But we also are working to tell the story of this important political history embodied inside of this historic space. Next slide. So I hadn't heard of Pauli Murray before probably about 4 years ago. What I learned is that Pauli Murray is the first African-American Episcopal saint, co-founder of the National Organization of Women. Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, she would dedicate her very first U.S. Supreme Court briefing in the memory of Pauli Murray. She is this overlooked and unknown civil rights leader in the United States. And so we are working to preserve her childhood home, which is in Durham, North Carolina, to create a center for social justice in her memory. Next slide. Claiborne Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. You all know that the American Civil Rights Movement is one of the founding and fundamental American stories. In 1968, Dr. King was invited to lead the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis. Inside of this historic church is where the I Am a Man posters were designed and pressed. It's where Dr. King would lead 15,000 protest marchers to City Hall. These activities happened the week before he was assassinated. We have partnered with this organization, investing in them hiring their first preservation manager and funding that position. We helped them to establish the founding board called Historic Claiborne Temple, and we are working on a stewardship plan to revitalize this historic space and to position it as a cultural and anchoring institution within this neighborhood. Next slide. Nina Simone. Nina Simone transcended the constraints placed on Black female performers in the mid-20th century to become the voice of the American Civil Rights Movement. The legendary comedian and civil rights activist Dick Gregory said, "We wanted to say it, but she said it." We're working with 4 New York City-based visual artists who, as a form of arts activism and politics, when this property was threatened with demolition, they created an LLC, purchased the property, established a partnership with the National Trust, and we are leading the project management and development of a stewardship plan, and I'm optimistic that this space will be used to tell her story, but most importantly, this project will help to stimulate a new creative economy in a rural town with a population of 2,500 people. It really is an opportunity for placemaking through the lens of preservation and Black culture. And what I think is most important, when you look at this simple, unadorned historic building, at first glance, it doesn't seem to hold a lot of meaning and significance. But once you pull back the layers and discover that a legend like Nina Simone would learn to play the piano and would be born inside of a space like this, it is worthy of preservation and reflective of many of the African American historic places here in the United States. Next slide. So the Southside Community Arts Center, which is in Chicago, this organization has existed for more than 80 years. It is a space where Black artists were able to express their creativity and identity. They created a real sense of community and a arts renaissance on the South Side. We have partnered with this organization to develop sustainable and viable business models that will ensure that they are contributing to the future culture making and revitalization of this disinvested historic African American neighborhood. Next slide. So one of my favorite projects of all time is Madam C.J. Walker's Villa Lawara. Madam C.J. Walker was born in 1867, the first person in her family born free, in Delta, Louisiana. She would become America's first self-made female millionaire. Not Black millionaire, but America's first self-made female millionaire. She created hair products for Black women's hair to grow and to be healthy. She would train and employ more than 23,000 sales agents and workers in the United States, South America, and across the Caribbean. When she accumulated her wealth in 1918, she hired the first licensed Black architect in the state of New York. His name is Vertner Tandy. So this was a home that she built in Irvington, New York, on the same street as Jay Gould's Lyndhurst, considered the most significant Gothic revival architecture in the United States. And this house sits 3 miles from the John D. Rockefeller Estate, Keiket. Next slide. I wanted you to see this image from 1924 when she convened her annual meeting with her sales agents at Villa Lawara. It's a 20,000 square foot Italianate mansion. We partnered with the former property owner who wanted to ensure that Villa Lawara would be protected in perpetuity. Next slide. And I'm proud to say that today the National Trust holds its very first easement on Villa Lawara to protect both the exterior and partial interiors, like the amazing architectural details that you see here. This is really a rare historic resource for being both architecturally and culturally significant, but it retains exceptional architectural integrity. And it's just majestically beautiful. It stands as a historic residence that embodies the optimism and perseverance of American entrepreneurship. Next slide. So the A.G. Gaston Motel in Birmingham, Alabama, I think is arguably one of the most significant civil rights sites in the United States. and arguably around the world. When you look at this vacant motel, you would never imagine that on the second floor in historic room 30 is where Dr. King, Reverend Shuttlesworth, and Reverend Abernathy and the entire American Civil Rights Movement would descend in the spring of 1963. Their activities and the protest marches in the spring of 1963, known as the Birmingham Campaign or Project C, that those efforts would break the back of segregation across the South, would be a catalyst for the 1964 civil rights legislation. And it demonstrates that Black women, men, children, and our allies, that they tested and affirmed the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. Next slide. We believe that this story and this place was worthy of being memorialized permanently as a unit of our national park system. And I'm glad to say that today, the Gaston Motel is the object and centerpiece of the newly created Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument that also includes contributing structures like 16th Street Baptist Church and Kelly Ingram Park. And this image is from May 10th, 1963, when the civil rights leaders held the truce with white business leaders in Birmingham to end the 2 months of protest marches in Birmingham. Next slide. So our work with the Action Fund, $25 million campaign to support the preservation of 150 Black history sites across the United States. In essence, our work is about creating new forms of partnership, interpretation, and community. We are committed to creating more space for new voices and leadership. Next slide. So the first thing that we did was create a national advisory council and board of the Action Fund. We have 20 members that are esteemed national leaders. The co-chairs of the Action Fund includes Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, and actor and director, Miss Felicia Rashad. Some other luminaries includes Dr. Lonnie Bunch, who is the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who is the first African-American chair of the History Department of Harvard University and the national president of the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History. A lot of amazing leaders that are advising us and helping us to secure the partnerships and support to do this important work. Next slide. We also have created a fellowship program that's creating space for students and emerging and seasoned professionals. This year, we had a cohort of 4 creative minds, including Brianna Rhodes, who is a freelance journalist writing about our Action Fund grantees. Candace Taylor's recent book about the Green Book, and it's a fantastic read if you haven't read it, Over the Overground Railroad is the title of the book. She is identifying 10 Green Book sites in Harlem that are eligible for listing in our National Register of Historic Places. Yoruba Richin created the Smithsonian Channel's documentary on the Green Book. It aired last year. It's fantastic. And so she is producing a short documentary on our work to preserve the John and Alice Coltrane home in New York. And then Jenna Dublin, a PhD candidate in urban planning at Columbia University, was a co-author of our recent report titled Preserving African-American Places, a path, preservation as a path for equity, that looks at the connection between preservation and issues of affordability, displacement, and gentrification. Next slide. We have a program called HOPE Crew. It stands for Hands-On Preservation Experience. So we are looking to create space for the next generation of conservation and preservation trades professionals who will care for and help to restore African-American historic places. We also see this as an opportunity to create a pipeline and to engage underrepresented citizens and individuals in the work of historic preservation. And so we work with youth between the ages of 16 to 25. And these three gentlemen were working to restore the historic Iron Gate at the Coltrane property. Next slide. So preservation as equitable investment. Next slide. So the $25 million that we raised is a pathway for directing new and equitable investment in the preservation of African American historic sites. One way that we do that is through our national grant program, which is the external facing kind of component of the Action Fund. So I just wanted to highlight these statistics. We've had 3 grant rounds since the inception of this program in 2018, and we've received almost 2,000 proposals requesting nearly $200 million. It does not represent the scale of need in the marketplace and across the American landscape. So in that time, we have invested in 65 preservation projects nationally, invested almost $5 million, and we will be inviting proposals on December 3rd and investing another $1.6 million in July. And this is the way, through this investment, that we empower communities to demonstrate their exceptional stewardship capacity and potential for saving American history. Next slide. So I just want to conclude with the why. We are at a moment of inflection and a cultural reckoning. 2020 has shifted our national and international conscience. We are investigating the ways that our profession has not lived up to its social responsibility of being inclusive and equitable in our practice. We are working to expand the American story and to ensure that there is diverse representation across the American cultural landscape. And most importantly, we are repositioning preservation and its values as a tool for bringing communities together and hopefully helping people across different ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds to relate to one another better. Finally, the last slide. This is why we do this work. We are responding to this question. Why do we have to keep telling you Black Lives Matter? These words were spray painted on the side of the Decatur House in Washington, D.C., which sits in the shadows of the White House. This happened during the protest marches of the Black Lives Matter movement here in Washington, D.C. We believe we will be able to measure our success if we are able to leverage preservation to respond to this provocative question. So to learn more about the Action Fund, next slide, please. You can go to savingplaces.org. and join us in our work to tell the full American story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent. It's really, really fascinating for all of us, I think, and gives a very different picture to what we're used to here in Scotland. I have a couple of questions because we actually have a few before our next presentation. So I'm just going to tail on you briefly now. One is really practical. You say you've got how is your funding put together? Is that all by private donations or is it federal support?
So it's no federal support. The National Trust, we were chartered by Congress in 1949, but we are a private nonprofit organization. And so the majority of our funding, we've raised 25 million in the last 3 years, currently developing a strategic plan for 2.0 of the Action Fund, likely in the range of about 50 million, maybe 75 million top. But the majority of that is from foundations. So we have about 20 foundations. The major supporters are Ford, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, JPB, Keenan Charitable Trust, and others. We have also individual giving, so individual donations that range from the kind of small donations of $25 to the top end, which is a $2 million individual gift from a very, very generous family. And then as of recent, in particular because of the Black Lives Matter protest movement, we've started to secure new corporate support that's been ranging between $50,000 and $250,000.
I think that's really interesting because here in Scotland, if there were a theme that was that important to understanding national heritage, we would see that as a role of government to support, and we would expect to see our national agency, which is Historic Environment Scotland, step in with a specific grant funding programme for that heritage. And I think it's interesting that in that roundup of potential funders, you don't even mention the idea of going to the government and saying, where's our chunk of funding for this?
Well, we do have a partnership with a government agency, and it's with the National Endowment for Humanities. And they invested $500,000 to help us launch a pilot $1 million HBCU Cultural Heritage Stewardship Initiative, where we will fund 2 campus-wide preservation plans and 6 individual building preservation plans. And then through our government relations department, we have advocated for federal investment in African American historic places, and over the last 5 years have successfully lobbied for new diversified National Park Service programs and investment. And that is about $100 million. It's supporting the Civil Rights National Grant Program, the HBCU Preservation Program, the Underrepresented Communities Grant Program, and then these networks, which is more about promotion and visibility for some of these projects. Very
interesting. And I have a slightly different other question, which was really about interpretation. I was very interested about the interpretation of the Woodrow Wilson House. I thought that was a very interesting way of looking about it, how to make it equitable. I thought that was very different to what we would normally see here. And then I was looking at the other sites that you presented, and I was struck by how humble a lot of them were, apart from obviously the Villa Loire, which is just an amazing structure. But the rest of them, I thought the interpretation is going to be incredibly important to getting the significance of the site across. And I assume that that is something in particular that perhaps is more difficult than with your classic historic environment site where you walk in, you know, and you see this fantastic building and you immediately get that sort of 3D sensory perception thing that you're talking about at the very start of your lecture.
Yeah, that's very true. And partly, I would say that the challenge is when we created the kind of infrastructure for preservation in the US, which is through the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, in many ways, the way that we define what is significant and worthy of preservation has been based on architectural significance. And then the way that we kind of score whether or not something should be preserved is the amount of historical integrity retained within that building. Many African American historic sites aren't architecturally significant. They were never constructed to last the span of time. And they are these unintentional monuments that once you start the process of understanding their cultural value, we have been successful in helping the preservation movement understand that architectural significance and cultural significance should be equally weighted, and that we have to move from only supporting monuments that were intended to be preserved in perpetuity.
And I think that's fascinating. That's something that we struggle with here, I would say, because similarly in Scotland, the list of protected structures, list of buildings is set up here to reflect architectural and historical significance. In Ireland, where I'm from, it's protected structures, and it's a much broader focus because of that same sort of oral tradition of storytelling. And I think that's perhaps a gift of a more equitable system of recognizing significance, is that we start to look at buildings in a more broad context as to why they are important to people and how we interpret them and what it is that we're trying to preserve and the stories that we're trying to tell future generations. I'm just going to slip on now to the chat and slip in a couple of questions before we go on to our next speaker. Jay Lamb has asked a really good question. Why do you use the word preservation rather than conservation?
Well, I think conservation is more of the international kind of choice of words for describing our profession and our collective profession and work. So in the United States, it's historic preservation. Most of the times when I'm communicating the values of this work, I call it cultural preservation, because in essence, we are preserving Black culture in American history, and the tools that we use are historic landscapes and buildings and objects and artifacts to do that. So for me, it's about linking culture and preservation together, but they're one and the same.
Oh, I think that's a Pandora's box you've just opened there. I'm not going to have that argument about preservation and conservation. A more straightforward question, perhaps, from Sarah Holloway, who asks, can you give us a bit more information about the Hope Crew program? How do people get involved? What kind of stuff do they do exactly? What kind of training is in place for that? Because we have similar ones here, but I suspect they're run slightly differently in the States.
Yeah, so we've got two different programs, and this program has been around it's in its 6th year now. And we work with about 200 preservation projects, thousands of volunteers and youth. So the Intro to Preservation Trades is a paid position for students between the ages of 16 to 25. Small teams, generally around 5 or 6, they will be paired with a qualified preservation trades professional, and they learn the basics. So historic window restoration, basic carpentry work. And so that Nina Simone project, they painted the exterior of the house. You know, it's that kind of basic kind of introduction to the history, but also to trades. And then these Hope Crews last between 2 to 6 weeks, and again, they're paid. The other Hope Crew is our Preservation and Practicum. And this is where we partner with HBCUs, schools of architecture. And this is our pipeline for creating the next generation of Black professionals in this work. And we partner with them over a period of 6 weeks. They go to Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. They learn preservation theory. And then they come back to their campus and apply that to a real world project. And I'm delighted to say that this 2-year program, one of the pilot students is now getting a dual degree at the University of Pennsylvania in architecture and preservation. And we hope that she becomes the first of many that will decide that preservation should be their career and life's work.
What an interesting pipeline to be developing. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there for the moment. Brent will be back for our Q&A session at the end of this particular round of presentations, but thank you very much for the time being. I know there are loads of questions coming through in the chat. We will sift through them and come back to you, Brent, slightly later on.